So part two of aggregate expenditures, we're going to go over what is often referred to as the Keynesian cross. The word cross is simply used to talk about the point at which the aggregate expenditures curve crosses our equilibrium GDP line or the 45-degree line. You'll see what those are in a few minutes here. So to start this out, we have a graph here where we're going to chart out what's known as a consumption schedule. On the vertical axis, we have consumption. This is also referred to often as aggregate expenditures. An expenditure is consumption. It's I think we're all pretty familiar with that synonym relationship between the two words. Aggregate goes before expenditures to point to the fact that we're not talking about just one person. Remember, this is a macro class. We're talking about everybody's consumption altogether. So when I say aggregate expenditures, I basically just mean consumption, and that's what's on the vertical axis here. Disposable income is on the horizontal axis here. And so what this graph is charting out is a relationship between the typical person in society. We're aggregating to talk about, if you take everybody's consumption, someone who spends a lot, someone who spends a little, in terms of the percentage of their income, and you just average them all up. So income is going to be the variable that's driving consumption. And we're going to see that as income goes up, as one would expect, consumption is also going to go up. So what is this little point A? Well, this point is, well, first of all, you will recognize this as the y-intercept. The y-intercept, going back to math classes, the graphing parts of math classes, you were told you were expected to know at the beginning of the semester. The y-intercept is simply the point at which the x variable is equal to 0. What does y equal when x equals 0? So when income is at 0, this A refers to autonomous consumption. So autonomous consumption, the amount that you are consuming when your income is 0, is right here. Now, why on earth is it right here instead of down here at the origin? If your income is 0, shouldn't consumption be equal to 0? Well, remember, we're in the short run here. We're not in the long run. In the long run, if you have no income, you have no consumption, you're probably going to end up dead. Of course, Keynes has his famous expression, in the long run, we're all dead. But remember, we're dealing in the short run. In the short run, you have savings from previous periods, and you have the ability to borrow. You have to eat. If you don't, you're going to die. It's not a biology class, but if you don't believe me, ask your biology teacher. You can pretty much expect you're not going to live very long if you don't eat. You have to eat. You have to spend money on shelter. And even at zero income, a lot of people, this is reality we're talking about. Oh, it's an econ class. We're not talking reality. Okay, well, if you want to talk about reality, people will spend on luxuries too, even if they have no income. The average person in society, you take all society together, people have to consume something. So if income is at 0, people will go into savings, they'll borrow money, whatever they've got to do to spend whatever they need to spend to be at this point. So this is the 0 income amount of consumption. When income is 0, this is what consumption will be. Then, when income increases from 0 to something out here, obviously consumption will increase, perhaps to a point right here. Notice that the change, we don't have a 45-degree line here. We have a flatter line. This is because some of the money is saved. Remember, you can consume income and you can spend income. You look at the entire society, even if some people don't save anything, there are going to be some people who do. So we're always going to draw this as a line that's a little bit flatter than a 45-degree line. Income goes up, consumption goes up, but not by as much as income rises. And we can chart this out all the way to infinity if we want to. As income goes up, consumption goes up, and we have a whole bunch of different points that correspond with the level of consumption we have when income has risen to a certain place. And of course, you connect those points together to get a straight line. And so our consumption schedule is simply a straight line that represents how consumption increases for the average person in our macroeconomy as disposable income increases. So this equation right here is one version of what's known as an aggregate expenditures equation. I usually do AE equals C naught, C with a sub-zero there, plus MPC times Y. Because Y is income, and so I put the Y in for income instead of an I, and I put AE instead of C. But just to relate it to the graph we're using, we're going to go with C equals A for autonomous expenditures plus marginal propensity to consume times income. This is the equation of this line right here. Remember, the equation of a line is y equals mx plus b. Y, this right here, is equal to m times x, which is m, the slope of the line, multiplied by the variable x, plus b, which is the intercept. So this is the same equation here. This is the b part, this is the m part. In other words, this is the y-intercept, this is that a that we saw intersecting the line here, and this is the slope, the rise over run. The line goes up according to marginal propensity to consume. Remember, marginal propensity to consume is a ratio, like a slope. It's a rise over a run. It is a rise in consumption, change in consumption, divided by the run, the change in income. So MPC is the slope, and I, income, is the x variable here. So y equals m times x plus b. The commutative property of addition allows us to flip these around. We do that so that we have the intercept, the autonomous consumption, right next to consumption. So this is the consumption function. So when I refer to a consumption function, I'm talking about this. And it can be aggregate expenditures or consumption, and we can use any variables to represent these, but it's all the same thing. So we have our consumption schedule. But we do have a 45-degree line, as promised. This 45-degree line is every possible point in this economy. We cannot have points out here. We cannot have points here. This line is described as C equals D times I. What all that's basically saying is that consumption is equal to real GDP. We had income here, but remember, one of our ways of computing GDP is to look at everybody's income and add everybody's income up. We can't get a GDP if we don't have market transactions from which we have prices revealed, and those prices get divided up among everybody as far as income is concerned. The spending is going to be out of people's income. Real GDP is often referred to as national income. So consumption and GDP have to be equal at equilibrium. Well, if they're going to be equal, then they're going to be represented by a 45-degree line. So we have a 45-degree line, and we have a flatter line, which is our consumption line. And they intersect at this spot right here. So why do we have a line that passes through space that I just said is not possible? Well, remember, this is the same as with the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. We have an aggregate demand curve that goes through a whole bunch of space on a graph, and an aggregate supply curve that goes through space on that same graph, none of which is a point that the economy can possibly be at. It can only be at the equilibrium point. However, we still need the entire curve to describe the relationship between the two variables, GDP and the price level, in terms of the ADAS model. And here, the relationship in the short run between income and consumption is just charted out by this line. And then we have a real GDP intersection here, and this is where we always are with the economy. So what happens is, if If our marginal propensity to consume changes, we get a new line with a new slope. And if autonomous consumption changes, we get, again, a new line with a new slope. And it'll shift up or down and intersect the economy in different places, and that'll represent GDP rising or falling. So if income goes up, one thing that's going to happen is autonomous consumption is going to go up, and we're going to have a new line with a new real GDP that's going to intersect this 45-degree line at a higher point. So this is another way of looking at our aggregate expenditures model, where now we have our consumption is aggregate expenditures, and it's equal to real GDP, C plus I plus G plus NX. And this is just another way of looking at the same thing. And once again, it is referred to as the Keynesian cross because it's all about this crossing point right here, where aggregate expenditures or consumption crosses real GDP. That's where our economy is going to be. And this model is used to chart exactly what's going to happen to GDP as components of demand change. As consumption goes up, what will we expect to see as far as GDP rising? And we need this model to keep in mind that when we try to put extra money into the economy to increase GDP, we have to understand that people's spending patterns are not going to cause increased GDP on a dollar-for-dollar basis when we spend more money. This line is flatter than this line. And we're going to see this in a little more detail in the third video, where we use marginal propensity to consume, which is the slope of this line, to get a spending multiplier. And what that's going to mean is also going to become clear in the next video. But for now, this is the Keynesian cross, also known as our aggregate expenditures model.